really matters? That might be the most important question you can ask. So let's talk about it. Welcome to What Really Matters podcast, Everyday Spirituality with Karen Wyatt. And thanks for joining me here today. I am currently doing a little series for you on looking at some of the wisdom from the Tao Te Ching, a wisdom text that was written more than 2,000 years ago of Chinese philosophy, and then my own adaptation of that work, which is the Tao of Death. So 2 weeks ago, I talked about intellectual humility and read some verses around humility for you. Last week, we talked about suffering and transformation. And this week, I want to talk about the importance of inner work, having an inner life, which is one of the themes throughout the Tao. So I'm going to read some verses and we'll talk about those that emphasize how important it is that each of us do this inner work. And we've talked a number of times now about being on the inward arc of our lives, which comes after we've kind of exhausted our energy and our interest in focusing on the outward aspect of life, which is a career, job, family, housing, success, achievement, accomplishment, those outward signs of doing well and of living a good life. And we begin to turn inward in order to develop ourselves more spiritually. And for many of us, this inward turn, the inward arc, begins after some sort of event that may precipitate it, having an illness or suffering a loss, something that opens our eyes a little bit to the idea that there's more to life than just this physical existence that I'm surrounded by. There's something greater than that. And we tend then to turn within, to begin looking within ourselves for some of the answers that we need. And this is something the Tao teaches throughout, that we already have the answers we need. Once we begin on the inward arc, the answers we're searching for tend to be inside of us. However, it's all still a mystery. We don't get all the answers. We never know everything, and we don't find everything we seek. We have to learn how to live with the mystery and live with those things that cannot be answered for us. So I'm trying to give you a flavor of the Tao and what it teaches and how rich it is for our lives. And having a wisdom text like this can be really helpful, because once you get familiar with these verses, no matter where you are and no matter what you're experiencing, you can search through these 81 verses and find something that fits the situation that you're in. And always the verses are a little bit obscure, a little bit vague. They require you to think and to contemplate, what is the deeper meaning? What is this saying to me? So there's something that you read a verse and you sit with it for a while and maybe write about it. I really encourage writing in a journal about all the potential meanings of that verse. And then sometimes hours later or days later, something will pop up for you like, oh my goodness, I just got it. I just got what that verse means, or I just got how it applies to me. So what I find is having this little book on hand is a great resource and a tool for me to use when I'm going through a struggle, and sometimes it feels like, I'm losing my way. I can't remember what I'm doing here. I can't think of what's most important right now. And reading some of these verses always brings me back to the center, back to my inward self, back to the place where my equanimity exists, where I find harmony and peace and love and joy. So that's why I recommend having a text like this on hand. And again, I said this before, it isn't something that you should try and sit down and read in one sitting, which you certainly can. It's only 81 verses. you could read it all in one day, but you will have missed most of it because it's deep and there are layers of meaning. And so the very best way to read it, as I said before, is maybe one verse a day. Some people read one verse a week or one verse a month and take time really contemplating and thinking through the deeper meaning and utilizing it to enrich your life. So the book I'm reading from is my adaptation of the Tao Te Ching called The Tao of Death. It's available on Amazon, and I'll leave a link to in the show notes to a page where you can go to learn more about this book and my other books that I have available as well. So today I want to talk about how the Tao teaches us about having an inner life, and I have a few verses to read to you. A couple of them are a little bit longer. Some of the Tao verses are very short. Some are longer. And so these are a couple of longer ones, but bear with me as we read through these verses together and dive into the deeper meaning here about having an inner life. So the first verse I'll read is number 56. It's a little longer. And we'll kind of talk it through as we go and then spend a little more time diving into it. So it begins, those with true wisdom don't need to speak about it. Talking too much is a sure sign of knowing nothing. And that's a good callback to intellectual humility. We were saying before that sometimes the people who think they know the most actually don't really know a lot. They only know what they know, and they're unaware of how much they don't know. And that you're better off admitting that you don't know something than bragging about how much you do know. So that's a really powerful statement and a good callback to a couple of weeks ago when we talked about intellectual humility. But verse 56 goes on to say this: say only what really matters. So don't waste your breath and your time on fluff and on things that aren't true or things that aren't going to be helpful. Next, keep to yourself. Soften your hard edges. Untie the knots of resentment you carry. Shine your light on your own shadow and clean out all your hidden corners. Do your own inner work first. That is how you become aligned with the way of death. So let's look into that a little bit. Keeping to yourself, I talked 3 weeks or so ago about loneliness and recognizing that a certain amount of loneliness is necessary on the spiritual journey. When you begin your inward arc, that is when you are choosing a path that not everyone chooses, and that path will cause you to feel separated somewhat from other people because you're focusing on things that other people are not, that other people don't care about. And so you have to be content with keeping to yourself, experiencing that loneliness and solitude because it is an important part of your journey. The next piece of advice is soften your hard edges. So be able to look at yourself and see where you're defensive and where you get prickly and where you get triggered by things around you, because those are all signs of wounds that you're carrying inside that need some healing and need some attention. So this passage is saying you've got to go deep inside and you have to look at your pain. And pain is what creates the hard edges that we go through life with. And we have to be willing to re-experience that pain, examine it, embrace it, and integrate it within ourselves. And that's how we soften ourselves. Next is untie the knots of resentment you carry. And that means we have to learn how to forgive. We forgive other people, we forgive ourselves, we forgive life itself for the challenges it has brought to us. And the next line is shine your light on your own shadow and clean out all your hidden corners, because The shadow is what contains, again, the wounds and the pain of the past and the resentments that you're carrying. And the shadow hides all of those things so that you in your day-to-day consciousness may not even be aware of how large your own shadow is or how much is hidden there in the corners. And you have to bring light in to that dark part of your inner world in order to look at those things and examine the wounds, the pain, the resentments that you are still carrying with you. And it's a profound task to work on and can take years and a whole lifetime, in fact, to begin to unearth some of the shadow and to begin to find healing for some of the things that you're carrying. But the next line is, do your own inner work first. That is how you become aligned with the way of death. So I think the important message here is that we absolutely have to do this work that I'm talking about. It's essential. We cannot transcend it. We can't become enlightened. We can't expand in consciousness if we have not gone within, gone on the inward arc and done the inner healing that we need. And we see this happening a lot in the world. There are people who decide to seek a spiritual path who may embrace a certain religion. They gain a lot of knowledge about the religion. They learn practices. They may become really adamant about how to practice the religion that they're following, but they haven't done their inner work. So they have not truly become enlightened, and they haven't transcended any of the pain and haven't integrated any of the pain that they're carrying. So the spirituality that they're trying to demonstrate is coming from their heads. It's from the intellect. It's from something that they've learned, that someone else told them. And they're not truly aligned with their own spirit and truly aligned with the wisdom that they carry inside of them because they have not explored it yet. So this is a reminder, don't get caught up in spiritual ideas and practices if you haven't first done the work you need to do on the inward arc, going inside, doing this healing. So the rest of this verse says, only then, after you have done your inner work, can you become a teacher for the world. You will connect with everyone you meet, and they will long to be near you, even though you don't put yourself on display. You will need nothing more and be at peace with the ups and downs of life. Like the way of death, when you surrender everything, you will have exactly what you need. So again, this verse is saying you have to do this inner work in order to become a true teacher, in order to share wisdom with other people. You have to have done your inner work. And again, you can see examples all over in our world of people who are in positions of leadership and teaching, spiritual leadership, who it becomes obvious at some point have not done all their inner work because they're engaging in things like physical and sexual abuse of their students and manipulation of their students. And it's all because they didn't do the inner work first. They grasped and understood and tried to live by the higher principles, but they didn't do all the healing that was necessary to make them the best teachers they could possibly be. And one line that I just read that I wanted to reemphasize is, you will connect with everyone you meet and they will long to be near you, even though you don't put yourself on display. This is something that we talked about in the previous conversation on loneliness and also intellectual humility, that when you do this inner work, you become so authentic and so real and genuine that it is appealing and enticing to other people to be near you. Everyone longs to be near someone who is is filled with honesty and integrity and simply being themselves. And so that's what happens when we do our inner work. The more we heal from the inside out, the more it changes how we relate to other people. And I mentioned when we talked about loneliness that when your consciousness expands to a place of integral consciousness, and that's when you've integrated all the wounded and painful parts of yourself, embraced them, and you're living fully aware of everything that used to be hidden in the shadow, that is when you suddenly become able to relate to everyone and people with different ideas, different consciousness, people who behave differently and think differently and believe differently than you. You can suddenly relate to everyone because you are just a pure, authentic being. And you find a way, you find the right way to talk to everyone, regardless of their belief system, without offending or doing harm to anyone. And that happens when you attain that place of integral consciousness. So that is the outcome of doing all of this inner work, which is so very important for our lives. And so again, if we want to be teachers, the inner work just has to come first. It's essential. And the word surrender came up again in the end of this verse, which that came up in last week's verse as well, that surrender is one of the three most important treasures that we have in life. And the Tao talks about that. And being able to surrender is one of those treasures. So that's an equally important part of this inward journey that we're on. So the next verse I want to cover with you from the Tao of Death is verse number 38. And this talks a little bit about the difference between the ego and the soul. And this is also reflected in my book, The Journey from Ego to Soul, which talks through a lot of the practical aspects of trying to live a life that is guided more by higher consciousness and higher wisdom rather than driven by the ego. So this verse is about that as well, the differences between the soul. And if you don't like that word soul, I know some people are not comfortable with it. Think of, when I read soul, think of higher consciousness, higher self. Some people say the universe, some say the divine. Whatever is comfortable for you, you can substitute in for that word soul if it just doesn't sit well with you. So this is another long verse. We'll dive into it and we'll discuss some of the aspects of it as we go. So it begins, the soul behaves with goodness because goodness is the soul's nature. The ego can only pretend to be good and therefore cannot act with true goodness. The soul is naturally kind to all beings, but the ego must pretend to be kind. The soul behaves with fairness, honesty, and empathy without even trying. They are part of the soul's nature. One whose actions are inspired by the soul is a peacemaker who connects with everyone. That's what I was trying to emphasize in the talk on loneliness. When you come from higher consciousness and the soul, you are far more able to connect with everyone than when you're living in lower consciousness driven by the ego. So the next part of this verse says, the way of death teaches that the ego must surrender to the soul, which is eternal. For when the ego rules, genuine goodness is lost, kindness disappears, and peace is disrupted. Then fear of death becomes rampant, and humankind turns to science and religion to create an illusion of immortality. Thus, the ego creates chaos. So, this is a big verse with a lot of information contained in it, but the essence is that the purpose of our inward journey and our inward arc, We learn to differentiate between the ego and our higher self, and we learn to be guided by the wisdom of the higher self and no longer allow the ego to control our actions and our behavior. When we are driven by the ego, which is true of the vast majority of people in our society, you can look at our society, we have a very ego-driven society. And it is the ego that fears death more than anything. The ego is terrified of death, and that is rampant in our society as well. So we're struggling with goodness and kindness and peace in our society because the ego is in charge right now. The ego is running the show of most of the institutions and the systems that we see around us and most of the people around us. And so this verse, when the fear of death is rampant, we turn to both science and religion to create an illusion of immortality. So science tells us, oh, we can cure disease. We don't really have to die if only we do all these screening tests, and if we're constantly focused on our health and we make lifestyle changes or we take certain drugs, we can prolong our lives. And the whole idea behind it, it's an immortality project. It's seeking to be immortal. It's seeking to avoid death and prevent death and not allow death to happen, instead of recognizing death always happens and always will happen because it's part of life. It's natural. So when the ego's in charge, the fear of death causes us to resort and rely upon these institutions, science for one, on the one hand, but also religion, because religion teaches that there's an afterlife and you can be immortal in the afterlife. And many people cling to that if they behave in a certain way, if they adhere to the religion. Also, if they hate everyone who doesn't believe in the religion. That seems to be part of many people's belief systems, that it's necessary to hate and despise and control the behavior of people who don't have that particular belief system. But again, it's another immortality project. It's an attempt to become immortal. It's an attempt to find the afterlife and to find eternal life in the afterlife via religion. So religion and science traditionally have hated each other and been polarized from each other, but they're actually serving the same immortality desire in some ways, which is kind of ironic. But the fact is, we need both. We need religion, we need faith, we need science in the world and in our lives. But it's essential that we transcend both of them to this level of higher consciousness where we see what is beyond both of them. We embrace the nature, the natural cycle of life and death. We're no longer afraid of death. We recognize the presence of death everywhere around us, and we find a way to embrace it and to live with the knowledge that death is everywhere present within life. And that is part of the inward journey. And the ego resists the inward journey because of its fear of death, because it does not want to be confronted with the reality of death. And so that's that and other reasons why the ego will resist the inward journey. But the entire success of the inward journey depends upon being able to get beyond the narrowness, the short-sightedness, and the smallness of ego, to see the higher consciousness, to experience that higher view, and to begin to be guided in life by it. So we'll read the last little section of this verse number 38. Therefore, one who follows the way of death allows the ego to be stripped of its pretenses, so that the soul can guide with genuine goodness that serves the well-being of all. This is the nature of the way of death. So again, the outcome when we do our work on the inward arc is that the ego loses some of its control over us. The ego loses the false self aspect of ego, and we can find the true ego within us as an important part of ourselves, of our wholeness, that helps us survive here on the planet, that helps us, it's a vehicle that helps us get around and navigate and negotiate and survive our life here on this planet. And that's the appropriate role for the ego to play. But the ego has to be stripped of its false pretenses so we can allow the higher consciousness to be the guide and the ego to be the companion and the servant of higher consciousness. And that is one of the outcomes of doing this inner work that we've been talking about. So that's a pretty profound and deep verse. And as I was saying, you can't just read that along with 80 other verses and grasp everything that it's talking about. You could spend days just unpacking each line or each paragraph of that verse. So the last verse I'm going to read is a little bit shorter, and this is kind of as a way of closing this conversation. This verse is number 44. It says, "One who does not fear death embraces a new definition for success." So again, this would be after doing some of the inner work and rising above the fear of death. There's a new definition for success. Would you rather be famous and known by everyone, or have a deep inner knowledge of yourself? Would you rather have a great deal of material wealth, or be rich with spiritual wisdom? Would you rather accumulate every possession you desire, or learn to let go of everything you don't need? Focus on being content with what you have and managing the excesses of ego. You will live a fulfilled life and have endless energy for bringing love to the world. So this is another way of talking about that contrast between the ego, the outward arc of the ego, and the inward arc of the higher self. Do you want to be famous, or do you want to know yourself, your inner world? Do you want to have material wealth, or do you want to be rich with spiritual wisdom? Do you want to accumulate every possession you desire, or do you want to let go and surrender all the things that you don't actually need for your life? So again, it's reminding us, another reminder with a different way of looking at it, that the inner journey is so worth it to us. We will be rich beyond measure with love and joy and peace when we go on the inner journey. But it requires us to turn our attention away from fame and success and riches and material possessions. We turn our attention away from it. It doesn't mean that we can't have those things in our lives. We may have all of those. It's possible to be famous and still have a rich inner life. It's possible to be wealthy and have lots of material possessions, but still have a rich inner life. The message here is, don't sacrifice or forget your inner life in service of seeking all of these outer pleasures and outer trappings of success. Have whatever you receive in your life from on your external journey is fantastic. Just don't forget the inner work. And sometimes people substitute material wealth or material well-being for doing the inner spiritual work, which is hard and it takes effort and intention. So this is just a reminder, don't forget that. Don't forget your inner life, and to pay attention and to spend a little time every day going within and working on yourself. And that's how you'll fulfill your life purpose, and you'll have energy to bring more love into the world, which I think that's really a beautiful goal for each one of us to have. So if you enjoy these kinds of discussions and this contemplation of these spiritual ideas and this type of wisdom, you might like the book, The Tao of Death. Again, there will be a link in the show notes for this episode. You can also go on Amazon and search for The Tao of Death by Karen Wyatt, or go to eoluniversity.com/books. And there are links there for buying each one of my books if you're interested in those. So I'll be back next week with another bit of wisdom from the Tao. And until then, remember that we're here for love. Love is really what all of this life is about. That's the greatest wisdom of all. So face your fear, be ready for whatever life brings you next, and love each and every moment of your very precious life. Bye-bye.